welcome back to all of you who joined for our first session of Healing Haunted Histories, and a big hello to those who are just joining for the first time today. My name is Matt Harper. I use he, him pronouns. On behalf of all of those who helped make today possible, we are so glad to have you here with us. Now, while land acknowledgements are insufficient offerings to those who have faced the never-ending violence of colonization, we also recognize one part of the process of healing and repair is naming truths. That's what brought many of us here today. So here in what we now call Los Angeles, we know that there are many tribes and bands, separate and interconnected communities that have been the stewards of this earth, who have lived and loved and prayed and resisted, and who continue to do so today. We seek to honor the original peoples of the unceded land many of us are on. That includes the Tongva and the Gabrieleño, the Kich, and the Fernandeño Tataviam, and the Ventureño Chumash, and their ancestors past, present, and emerging. But more than just recognizing, we're here today to begin to take responsibility for the history of our spiritual ancestors, my spiritual ancestors. We commit to helping Catholics and others to build and deepen our commitment and understanding, to sharpen our analysis of our histories, to grow our capacity to have difficult conversations, and to take responsibility for the part of this work that is ours to hold. For those who are outside the Los Angeles area, we invite you later to learn who the original caretakers are of the land you reside on. But more than just whose land it is, we invite you to learn their stories and to build relationships with them. Now, as we begin today and continue in the future, it is important that we consider how we move, the spirit with which we enter and engage these conversations. To reckon with anything requires a willingness to listen, to reflect, and to engage with care. As we begin today, we ask, will we listen before preparing to respond? Will we make space so that the often ignored voices can be centered? Will we lean into discomfort? Will we move with care? Will we begin to continue to practice acknowledging our biases, our socializations, our fears, and our egos? Can we be okay sitting here with more questions than answers, but committing to return to the work again soon? In a moment, we'll begin with a prayer that draws together assorted practices from the Catholic tradition. Now, we know that there are many spiritual traditions here today. Please know all are welcome, and as we pray, we invite each person to engage in a prayer or grounding that feels right or reflects your practice and lineage. But for those Catholics on the call, we have a particular responsibility to reckon with our mission histories, and because of that, let us see our rituals and practices as necessary tools available to us in the struggle for healing, for justice, and for truth. And so we bring them into this work with us.
Oh, on a Zoom right now. Thank you.
I invite you to take a couple of seconds to catch your breath, to quiet your mind, and to focus on your breathing. I invite you to look into your past and to find a time when you encountered a hard but reorienting truth, something that brought you into fuller awareness of something that you had not known before. Maybe it was a personal relationship, or in your understanding of systemic racism, or somewhere else. When you find that memory, I invite you to consider what feelings arose when you finally saw this truth. In the early days, maybe it brought pain, maybe it brought chaos, feelings of queasiness or heartbreak or anger or embarrassment. But over time, maybe it brought you somewhere else. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." Spit and touch. Transformation is a continued gift of the Spirit, but it is messy and physical. And like all transformation, it takes time. And Jesus reminded this man there was no going back to the places and ways he previously knew. I wonder how this changed man lived out the rest of his days. And so I ask each of you, what has come about in your life because you welcomed a reorienting truth? What tangible ways has your openness impacted your journey? I invite folks to take just a moment and maybe to write one sentence in the chat to describe how your life has shifted because you opened yourselves to hard truths and new ways of seeing. I know for me, I believe now the stories of those directly impacted by systems of oppression, and I believe it cannot be ignored, but rather that they must be centered. See Reverend Liz say, it's helped me to feel in my body that reality that we are all interconnected and that our liberation is bound up with each other's. Thank you. I see David suggesting that receiving the hard gift of responsibility and deeper love. I was stretched beyond my worldview. Please feel free to continue putting them into the chat. And as we examine the conventional narrative of the mission system today, we will explore the simplistic stories many of us learned as children, and we will begin to touch the trauma and violence and horrors that were often intentionally left out of so many of our formations. We hope this opens doors for awareness and action. A few thoughts first, though. Let us accept the likelihood that we will be uncomfortable at the intersection of race and religion, privilege and oppression, along with our ancestors and our own roles within them. But let us not confuse discomfort with being unsafe. We must be brave and leave our comfort zones to be able to be at a place where we can grow and ultimately to flourish. That said, take care of yourself, particularly if you find stories that you hear today resembling deep wounds that you still carry with you. We trust you to know your body and what you need. And please know you can reach out if you need or want any support. The presenters at our last session, Elaine Enns and Ched Myers, offered us this reflection in their book. They said, when dealing with painful and unsettling issues, shedding light also adds weight. By any measure, the subject of decolonization could not be heavier, not to mention more multidimensional in its reach, or universal in its relevance, or complex in its implications. But it could also, they said, not be more important to both settler and indigenous health. And so for the sake of our restoration to wholeness and for those indigenous communities seeking the same, we invite you to consider what practices you have to go deeper and to keep yourself open to hearing hard information as you participate today. Name if feelings of defensiveness or denial arise. Unpack where those might be coming from, but continue to listen to the wisdom that comes from the powerful crossroads of both scholarly research and the ancestral histories of Native communities. For too long, our church has refused to reckon with the destruction our spiritual ancestors did to Native life, culture, and land, among many others things. For too many centuries, the descendants of those Native communities themselves who lived at the missions, have had to hear narratives about their ancestors' wisdom, culture, and lives that are untrue, unjust, and simplistic caricatures of partial stories. We come not to guilt, but to confront, not to be uncomfortable, but so we might move into action, not to isolate and turn inward, but so as to foster a connection and inspire solidarity. We come so that Indigenous people will no longer have to hear a narrative about the missions that their tribal histories and good research radically disputes. For this, today, we have the gift of having Dr. Jonathan Cordero with us. Dr. Cordero is Ramaytush Ohlone and Chumash, among other Native tribes. Dr. Cordero beautifully weaves together the rigor and precision required of academic studies in his work at UC Hastings, in his research with the Critical Mission Studies Project and beyond, with the ancestral wisdom and truths known only to those who have the lived experience of the systemic violence of settler colonialism. We are honored to have his expertise, his time, and his commitment to this project and other grassroots projects for healing, justice, and truth. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Cordero.
Well, thank you, Matt, for that introduction. And it was actually a really moving opening, so it's much appreciated. Want to say just at the outset that this is a great sort of segue from Healing Haunted Histories, which if you look on the back of the book, I did review. And of course, I know Elaine and Ched. I've known them for several years now. I'm grateful for their work and familiar with what they do. Today is going to be really a conversation for us more than anything. I'm really here as a resource. I've been living this sort of, if I can say that way, as a Christian, as a California Indian, and also as a scholar for several years now. I've read just about everything. I've heard just about everything. Or so I thought until the other day. I was in an interview online on radio with David Bolton, who's the CEO of the California Missions Foundation. And he said some new things. I thought that was very interesting. But today, I really just want to share with you a few things. And let me just start by sharing a few thoughts with you to give you a sense of what this world is like for California Indians. We have been living with this romantic myth of the missions that I'll get into in just a minute for a very long time. And there is just very little evidence to support it. And it was really fascinating to me, if I can, to see my academic colleagues turn from these, rational, logical, reasonable people to becoming completely irrational and vitriolic when defending the Catholic Church against these charges that we're going to talk about today. It was remarkable to see. And so one of the questions that we were trying to answer, I hope you all are trying to answer, is what's really going on here? Why are academics like myself, who in this case are defending the Catholic Church and Junipero Serra, why are they using irrational explanations that are not grounded in any evidence at all? Why do they persist in doing so, right? And so it was really interesting to see those transformations in my colleagues, because this inevitably for lots of people is also about their faith and defending the interests of the Catholic Church, something that they've lauded for a long time and show a vested interest in. You all can probably do a better job of answering that question than I can, which is why does the Catholic Church persist in disseminating information that is patently false? And I'll give you some examples as we get started here. The second thing that I want to say is that in my professional opinion, the focus should be on the California mission system and not on Junipero Serra. Junipero Serra's real only claim to fame is being the founder of the California mission system. He was unremarkable in his accomplishments in regards to just about everything else. And I'm putting aside his personality, analysis of his personality and character, because if you analyze his personality and character with the information that we do have from a Catholic perspective, then you probably end up thinking he's an amazing guy. But we're not here to evaluate his character. We're here to talk about what he did. And what he did was found the California mission system. That's his remarkable accomplishment. So the question should be about whether or not the California mission system was remarkable and worthy of the kind of praise that it gets for its founder. So the focus today is really going to be on the California mission system and not about Sarah, but I'm happy to answer questions about Sarah too as we go along. The third thing I want to say is there's two ways of thinking about this, and I've been trying to say this more and more as we go along. It is not just enough for California Indians to tell their truth, or California Indian scholars to tell their truth about the mission system in California. We also have to unpack the arguments of pro-Catholic supporters. Because if we don't do that, it ends up becoming an argument where the Catholic Church says this and the California Indians say this, and then we're at an impasse. In other words, we're just then offering an alternative to the conventional narrative. But the conventional narrative is seriously flawed and highly problematic. And again, we'll work through some of that as well. So those are the three things I just want to start you with, and to get you thinking critically about this. And we're going to start, if you don't mind, with a little PowerPoint and go through some information to give you just a feel for what this is like for us and for me based on my research. And I can talk to you about my research and my qualifications and all that later if you really need to know. But let's just dive in, and I'll share some information with you, and then hopefully it's a good place to generate questions and discussion. So I want to start by talking very briefly about the romantic myth of the California missions. And the romantic myth is often characterized in more global literature as a fantasy heritage. And there are some really interesting books and articles that have been written about it, what it is and why it exists. But basically the romantic myth is that the California Indians and the Spanish missionaries lived in harmony at the California missions. The California Indians wanted to be there. The missionaries were kind and generous and really wanted to help them, to use Sarah's own words, to do good. And of course, good defined by Catholic perspectives in this case. So that's the idea of the romantic myth here, is that they just worked side by side in harmony for their mutual interests. And that narrative is defended in lots of different ways. And I'll give you some examples of that next here. The first actually comes from the Catholic Church itself, and the second example from what I'll call today pro-Catholic supporters. But both over time, since 2015, and especially up into the present when California Indians were tearing down statues here in the last couple of years, both Archbishops Gomez and Cordero were, in defense of Sarah, were reproducing this narrative. And so the narrative is in the gray here. The idea is that Sarah walked from Monterrey to Mexico and back on a bad leg, to get a Bill of Rights for Native peoples. That's the narrative that we've heard from both archbishops in defense of Sarah. And of course, now also in defense of the California mission system. So two things. The first is Sarah did not walk from Monterey to Mexico. He had a bad leg. The longest he ever walked that we have a historical record of is from Mission San Carlos to Mission Santa Clara, basically from Monterey to San Jose. Otherwise, he rode a mule. So he rode a mule from Monterey to Mexico. He got, to San Diego. He got on a boat from San Diego to Tepic. He rode a mule from Tepic to Mexico and back. And so that's not my opinion. If you read the Franciscan scholars themselves, they're the ones who are going to be telling you that. So in this case, the Catholic Church is really ignorant of its own scholarship, but but for what reason? Of course, and the reason is it because it serves their interests not to do so. The second part of this is that Sarah went and got a Bill of Rights for Native peoples. Now, this myth of this Bill of Rights was actually started by Noel Mahoney, who was in charge of the Sarah cause back in, I believe, the 60s and 70s. He was stationed at Monterey. So he was in charge of the Sarah cause. And the Sarah cause was the literature that was being put forward to help get Sarah canonized. And so I went to the document that's obviously translated from Spanish to English here. And I want just to read the beginning of it to you. And there's a couple really interesting things that it says. Nowhere in this paragraph, by the way, and this is almost the sum total of it here, nowhere is there a delineation of rights for Native peoples. That was something that was made up by Noel Mahoney as a kind of apologetic and defense of Sarah. So he says, Your Excellency should notify the said officer and the soldiers. And these are the officers and soldiers who were stationed at the missions to help sort of retain order, that the training, governance, punishment, and education of baptized Indians, what the missionaries called neophytes, or of those who are being prepared for baptism, belong exclusively to the missionary fathers, the only exception being for capital offenses. In other words, control over the California Indians at the California missions was entirely the responsibility of the Franciscan missionaries, period. Even the soldiers who were there were under their authority, except in cases of capital offenses like murder, right? He said, therefore, no chastisement or ill treatment should be inflicted upon any of them, whether by an officer or a soldier, without the missionaries' fathers passing upon it. And now listen to this. He says, this has been the time-honored practice of this kingdom ever since the conquest. So at bare minimum, what Sarah is doing is gaining protections for the California Indians from the abuses of the soldiers at the missions. At bare minimum, that's the only protection that he is seeking here. But what's really interesting about this is there's no Bill of Rights because the missionaries were already, right? It says this has been the time-honored practice of this kingdom ever since conquest. The Franciscan missionaries were always in control of everything that happened at the missions. Sarah was going down to Mexico just to make sure that the civil authorities wouldn't impede upon his control, the control of Franciscans at the missions. That's all this was about. So what's really interesting about this then is that the civil authorities, like the governor of California, actually wanted to give California Indians more liberties. And Sarah is literally going down to Mexico and taking away those liberties. So he's not giving them rights, he's actually trying to take away rights that were trying to be given to the California Indians by the governors of California. That's the irony here, right? So this statement is just patently false. And this is a paraphrase of both of them and what they've said over the course of time. But Serra did not walk from Monterey to Mexico, and he did not attain a Bill of Rights. He gained some protections for California Indians against soldiers, but then again, only soldiers at the missions. There were soldiers outside of the missions who were raiding villages and raping women and things like that. He had no control over, of course, that group. But that's the sum total of it. So that entire statement is false. I think what's most important here moving forward, and we'll return to this in just a minute, is that the Franciscan missionaries were responsible for everything that happened at the missions. And that includes, if you read the first sentence again, the training, governance, punishment, and education. What we're going to call here in just a minute, the colonization of California Indians. Now, the Catholic Church isn't the only group that's responsible for this. There are pro-Catholic scholars out there who do similar kinds of things. This is one that I recently have used at my talk down in San Diego for the Critical Mission Studies project. And this is from an article by Maureen Christine Duggan, who's a economic historian, I think at Kent College. And she writes this. She says, if we recall that the missionary stipend was 800 pesos, then it emerges that far from exploiting Indians in these early years, missionaries actually transferred from 1/4 to 1/2 of their stipend to the native congregation. So two things going on here. First, she's writing this to convey the idea that the missionaries were very giving and caring, in this case, giving up half of their yearly income to the California Indians. So she's trying to create the impression in the minds of the reader that the missionaries are making sacrifices, right? In the interest of California missions, the California Indians in their care, therefore, they're really amazing people. Secondly, it says that the California Indians were not being exploited. Their labor was not being exploited. They were actually getting compensation for their labor. And that would be the other half of the Franciscan stipend. So each missionary at the California missions, you can see it here on the chart, received 400 pesos per person per year. And so they gave half of that to the California Indians and the other half they kept. So if you look at on the red on top, you can see that in the years from roughly 1769 to 1834, all of the Franciscans made about 200 pesos per year as individual people. The other half of their salary, the other half of the 400 pesos, went to the California Indians. Well, aren't they generous? Well, what did Marie Christine Duggan not do? And the answer is she didn't tell us how many pesos per Indian that money translated to. And so I did the work for her, because this is just another kind of willful ignorance. If you're an economic historian and you're making a comparison between two groups, you should be, complete in your comparison. But if you look at the numbers here, that means that the California Indians at these missions during these years received on average less than 2 pesos per year as compensation for their labor. Now, they worked roughly 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, about 275 days out of the year. Is 2 pesos per year fair compensation for that length of time of labor? And the answer is obviously not. And there's some other problems with it, but we'll skip those. What's really interesting, though, is that this article, and the main argument is worse than what I just showed you, this article received 2 awards. One from the California Missions Foundation and another from, I think it was the Western Historical Society. But it was the worst the least methodologically sound article I have read in a very long time, and I can't believe it was even published. So, so what's going on here? Well, the Catholic Church, as we know, has a tremendous amount of power and influence in the world, and they're disseminating false information, especially to the public and to their members about what happened at the California missions, obviously in defense of the Catholic Church. And pro-Catholic scholars are doing the same in their research. And when an article like this receives awards, it effectively gets canonized, right? It becomes an important part of the canon, and people start referring to it, for reference. And both of those things become huge problems for California Indians, because now we've got to not only combat this scholarship, but we've also got to unpack this scholarship, but we've also got to provide the alternative, right? So we've got a lot of work to do here. So let's shift now to talking about colonization. So what I just did was give you a little bit of insight into what the Romantic myth sounds like today. And then really we're talking about what the defense of the Romantic myth looks like and sounds like today. Let's talk about some historical facts. The Portal expedition into California began in 1769. It went all the way up almost to the tip of the San Francisco Peninsula and back down to San Diego.
Your hair is so beautiful.
And Portola's
I love that color.
Portola's main objective was to find the port of Monterey, and he missed it. He missed it on his first try, so he had to go back up again. And so he went back up to the port of Monterey to find Monterey, and the ship came up the coast, and they met together. And at this very tree, this photograph was taken in about 1886 in Monterey. At this very tree, in June 3rd, 1770, Junipero Serra performed mass, and then Gaspar de Portola, who is both the governor of California and in charge of the Spanish military, performed what we call a ceremony of possession. And they officially took possession of California during that ceremony. Now, why is this location more important than arriving in San Diego in 1769 and claiming San Diego for California? And the important point here is that Monterey effectively bookended Alta California. It allowed the Spanish to claim California all the way from what we now know as this, the national boundary between Mexico and the United States in Baja, all the way up through Monterey and beyond. So this was a really critical moment in California history. What happened, though, or has happened in the conventional narrative over the course of time, is that when we talk about the California missions, when the pro-Catholics talk about the California missions in their conventional narrative or the Romantic myth, the focus is almost always on evangelization and never on colonization. But Junipero Serra was a colonist more than he was an evangelist. In other words, the Franciscan missionaries were colonizers, not just evangelizers. Remember, they were in charge of the California mission system. And just real quickly here, when the tree fell down and died, they picked it up and brought it to Mission San Carlos in Monterey, and it's still there. So these are the important facts that get lost in the conventional narrative. And by the way, when I say conventional narrative, I also mean the Romantic myth, but my language is to call this the conventional narrative. The Spanish approach to colonization in California was really simple. It was reducción, or in English, reduction. The idea was to remove California Indians from the land to the missions and convert them to Catholicism, and Hispanicize them, make them productive economically, change their political system, and incorporate them into Spanish society. In this case, we really mean the Spanish social structure. The primary vehicles for the colonization of the California mission the primary vehicles for colonization were the missions, and the primary agents of colonization were the missionaries. Remember, in 1773, Sarah goes down to Mexico to get that so-called Bill of Rights. And he makes the argument that everything that happens at the missions was the responsibility of the Spanish missionaries. The mission system and the missionaries, not the colonists, not the Spanish military, were responsible for the education and training and governance of the California the California Indians, as Sarah said in that letter. This is the fact of history, and that the Catholic Church just refuses to really acknowledge. And so the focus on Sarah allows them to talk about evangelization. The absence of focus on colonization is really problematic. In my media interview on the radio, I think it was just a week ago, I was talking with the CEO of the California Missions Foundation, David Bolton, who I know and grew up in Santa Barbara with my family, the whole thing. And he called Spanish, what we would call Spanish colonization, he called it expansion. That's the word he used, expansion. When Portola comes into California, they call it exploration. Both of those are euphemisms of sorts for what it really was, which was colonization. They refused to call it colonization. If you look at the conventional literature, colonization was when settlers came up from Mexico to settle in California. It was not when the California Indians were removed from their lands and incorporated into the California missions. So we have to begin calling it what it is, and it's colonization. The primary institutions that were responsible for that were the missions. The primary people who were responsible for that were the Franciscan missionaries, period. That's it. They had some assistance from the Spanish military, but that's all. At the California missions, of course, these were some of the things that we expected to see in terms of their goals for the California Indians. So the primary purpose of that ceremony of possession at Monterey was to claim the land from San Diego to Monterey in the name of the Spanish Empire, so that the Russians wouldn't get it first or the English wouldn't get it first, whomever. Land and labor for the Spanish always went together. So if you conquered a land, you also conquered a people, and those people became your workforce. And so economically, the economic goals of the Spanish were to exploit native labor. And of course, the native peoples built the missions and raised the food and herded the cattle, etc. Their religious and cultural goals you're very familiar with: to convert and to Hispanicize. In the social structure, the purpose of incorporating California Indians into social structure was to place them at the bottom of the social structure so they could remain that workforce for Spanish colonists and others. And then the overall goal at the end of 10 years was to get California Indians to adopt Spanish law and methods of governing so that it could become a self-governing colony in service of the Spanish crown. That was the ultimate goal, to make these independent, self-governing colonies of California Indians in service of the Spanish crown. And that meant, selling produce and making money and sending it back to Spain. By the way, they never really achieved that in any great measure. Okay, just a few more things. I know I'm probably taking a little more time than I should, but there are questions about genocide, whether it was genocide, whether or not it was slavery, whether or not there was forced conversion, whether or not there was physical and sexual abuse. When I first started reading the scholarship, in this case, the conventional scholarship, of course I said, oh no, there wasn't genocide based on that scholarship. It wasn't slavery based on that scholarship. It wasn't forced conversion based on that scholarship. And there was no mention of physical and sexual abuse. But in my scholarship, I've actually found account after account after account, mostly from California Indians, of course, about physical and sexual abuse at the California missions. And so I haven't completed that research yet, but it's going to turn out to be roughly 1 and every 10 Spanish missionaries was found guilty of physical and or sexual abuse. And again, that's what we have evidence for. Likely the number is higher. There's another scholar who's writing an article about the mental instability of the Spanish missionaries in California. But the Catholic Church, of course, treats these Franciscan missionaries as if they're saints, and they are not. They are human beings, just as capable of flaw as anyone else. And so all of this scholarship is now finally coming out. So here's the big one. This is the one that is just really difficult to swallow for us. And I did these numbers. I used all of the data that was available. This is not from a sample. This is from all of the data that's available on the California missions. Sorry, I need to go back. There were about 80,000 California Indians who were baptized from 1769 to 1834. You can see roughly half were children, half were adults. But over 3/4 died within less than 9 years. So if you look at the very bottom, average life expectancy after baptism at the California missions was only 9 years. At the missions in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I live and work now, average life expectancy was less than 4.5 years. At Mission San Jose, average life expectancy was only 4 years. Whether you were born at the missions or brought in at the age of 12 or 25, your average life expectancy was only 4 years at that mission. And we can talk about causes of death later too. Just a few more things to finish up here. In regards to genocide, there's a really interesting argument. The pro-Catholic scholars are going to say it wasn't genocide because it wasn't intentional. When I was talking with David Bolton again, he said, what Franciscan missionary wanted to, give a sermon to an empty room? Okay, well, I mean, if California Indians died, they would just be replaced. So there was never an empty room, right? So that's nonsensical to make that statement. But the Franciscan missionaries were very well educated. They read the writings of their predecessors before they ever came to California or to Mexico. And their predecessors were always complaining about the high death rates for Native peoples in the Americas. So they all knew in advance that the California mission system would result in the high death rates of the Native peoples. They all knew in advance. So if you define genocide by foreknowledge, that is, if you know in advance that something's going to have a negative consequence and you go ahead and do it anyway, in this case, it results in mass deaths, is that genocide? And that is, of course, one definition of genocide. But there's another that actually goes back to the original definition of intentionality, and here it is. Mariano Payeras, who was the father president of the California missions, like Sarah was when he first got here, woke up in 1820 and wrote this letter to his superiors in Mexico. And he wrote this, he said, "Every thoughtful missionary has noted that while the Gentiles procreate easily and are healthy and robust, though errant in the wilds, in spite of hunger, nakedness, and living completely outdoors, almost like beasts, as soon as they commit themselves to a sociable and Christian life, in other words, as soon as they get incorporated into California mission system, they become feeble, lose weight, get sick, and die." And of course, the plague that this what he's calling a plague has adverse impacts or differential impacts on women and young children. So the missionaries have always known this. Mariano Payeras wakes up one day and actually puts this in writing. And so the question is, okay, well, if you're a Franciscan missionary and people are dying left and right, why can't you do something about it, right? You're supposed to love your neighbor and sacrifice your life for theirs, even if that means losing your job. Why aren't you doing that? Why do you continue? In other words, why do you persist in a program of incorporation of California Indians when you know that they have died, they are dying, and they're gonna die? Why do you persist? No one has ever found the answer to that, but the answer is actually in the letter that he wrote, the same letter. This is how he responded, and tell me if you've heard this before. He says this, he says, I do not believe that any single missionary is authorized to change or innovate anything in the fundamental administration of his mission. Therefore, no one whosoever can be blamed in particular for that situation. In other words, I'm just following orders. And again, historically speaking, where have we heard that before? There's an intentional ignorance here, right? And a deferral to some abstract authority somewhere for the persistence in a practice that you know is killing people. So very quickly, again, what are the consequences for California Indians? I'll go through this very quickly, but we've lost our land. We were almost nearly exterminated. In the San Francisco Peninsula, where my tribe is from, there was only one family that survived colonization. We lost our language and our culture. We were dispersed across the state of California when the missions closed. We've been denied legal status. We've been declared extinct. And ever since the close of the missions, we've lived effectively in perpetual structural poverty compared to other groups in the state of California. And to top it off, we are by definition ineligible for federal recognition because the criteria for federal recognition were not created with the California Indian situation in mind. All of that said, and I'm happy to answer questions that you have about anything, this is the question that I end up with in my scholarship, and no one, of course, no one has been able to provide an answer to this question. So here it is. How did the mission system benefit California Indians in a way that somehow justifies or makes worthwhile our loss of land, our enslavement, and if you don't like the word slavery, fine, use economic exploitation, our routine physical and sexual abuse, the near complete eradication of our people, our culture, our languages, and our community? What benefit of the California mission system justifies that? And you know the answer. There is no answer. There is no justification for it. But we can understand what those justifications are, right? And the obvious one is saving the souls of California Indians. For some reason, the Catholic Church thinks that all of those things are justified if California Indian souls were saved to Christ. And in a paper I wrote, I proved that less than 4% of California Indians were genuinely converted to Catholicism. And remember, more than 75% died. So we could say it this way. For every 100 California Indians who are incorporated into the California mission system, 4 were genuinely converted and 75 died an untimely death. That is no model of success. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cordero. I'm going to give folks a couple seconds just to take some breaths. This is just the beginning of the information that we need to spend time reckoning with and considering in our work. But thank you so much, Dr. Cordero, for giving us your time and your research and your care and love as a Native person, as an Indigenous person to this land. In our small breakout rooms right now, we offer 2 questions that you can reflect on to start the conversation. What's one thing that stood out to you from the presentation? Maybe something you didn't know. And then how does today's session impact your perception of the missions, of those who kept them going, or the narrative you learned previously? We'll be in groups of 5 for 20 minutes. So each person has 4 minutes to share. I ask that you please take time to make sure that everyone has shared speaking time. When we come back, we're going to invite you to share a sentence or 2 in the chat of something that has stood out to you. And then we'll continue our conversation about kind of where we go from here. If you're on a phone and we've muted you, you can push *6 to unmute yourself, but hopefully you should be unmuted when you go to breakout rooms. And we'll see you in 20 minutes. So thank you for diving in. Thank you for being vulnerable with this. And we invite you to see where it takes you. See you all shortly. All right, folks, welcome back. As you come in, thank you for diving into those small breakout rooms. Hopefully the numbers gave you sufficient space to dive into these conversations. The final folks are coming back. So welcome back, everyone. If you please feel free to mute yourself at the moment.
We weren't finished.
I'm sure you weren't finished, Bobby. And that's why we're glad to have you with us, because our work won't be finished after our session today. In order to get everyone's voice into the space, there's 51 of us. It would be impossible to all be unmuted and speaking. So we're going to invite you to take maybe 2 or 3 minutes and in the chat to share any big thoughts that came up during your conversations, or ideas that you were moved in thinking about, or questions that you're like, these are things that I'm thinking, well, what's after this, or I want clarification on this thing. After we do some sharing in the chat, we're going to open the floor for some question and answers with Dr. Cordero. And then if we still have time before our next piece, we'll have a chance for folks to share some of those reflections. But feel free to take 2 minutes now in the chat and just share key takeaways, things that you want to remember, that you want to make sure others remember, or any questions that you have. So we'll do this quietly so folks can have that space to process. And for anyone who doesn't know how to use the chat, at the bottom of the screen, there's a little word bubble that if you push it, it should pop up a chat bar on your right, and you can click in the message area to send a message. Maybe it's a story that you're remembering. Maybe it's a juxtaposition of something you had learned previously. Take another minute for those who are typing, and you can keep typing as we go, but please feel free to throw comments, questions. All right. So again, feel free to keep doing that. We'll read some of these out. Dr. Cordero, if they prompt thoughts or if they prompt responses, feel free to respond. And once we get through these, we can open the floor up to questions and answers. So there's this question around sources, which I think is important to think about where that comes from for us, both, what are the sources that we deem credible and what are the ones we don't? But it is important to know also what are our church's sources, and how diverse of information is there. Talked a lot about the individuals that died, wanting to know. Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Cordero.
No, sorry, I'm good. I
Okay.
just wanted to switch over to the chat and go ahead and keep going. I just wanted to, my video went out earlier when I switched over to chat. So I was going to just say, if I lose you, I'll come back, but I'm good so far.
Great, great. So wanting to know more about what caused people to die, we touched briefly on the statistics of death, but obviously each story and each reality is important to hold. So questions about that. A desire to have the conventional narrative represented by someone and the more embellished full story represented so that it could be in conversation and dialogue to dissect the same facts presented for their conclusions. Linda, this notion of the mission system, not Father Sarah, that focusing on the individual might be a distraction from the larger reality of the system. The long-term impacts of this mission system reverberating into our society and economy and church today. If we haven't processed how we've previously thought of evangelization, we run the risk of doing it again. That people have to face, relive, and share the truthful history. The ones who do that are the ones very ones harmed and hurt. That people have to relive the pain of that era and its continued effects. To what degree are we able to rationalize violence and harm against the body in the name of conversion or a general sense of rightness? Important takeaway the church often has done. Having visuals and stories as powerful tools in our process. Acknowledging the importance of hearing Native Americans' personal stories, how their families and tribes were and are affected. While there's one large story, there are many unique, smaller, and personal stories. Feeling a lot of shock in some of the groups, while others were not surprised by the fact that the mission systems were effectively genocide. Talking about visuals and words, which cannot be ignored, but there are pictures that can help bring this issue to life and break open hearts for change, that physical, tangible stuff. Looking at Sarah's actions, not character, how current religious communities can start to reckon and make amends with their participation in colonization, the power of statistics. We have to at least acknowledge the truth, which is something we'll be talking about in a little bit, about and allow the facts to speak for themselves on the impact of missions on First Nation people. Talked about the frustration it was for Indigenous people who bear the brunt of confronting the myth and exposing it, seeing this work expand and seeing perspectives shift regardless of how history is taught. The challenge of questioning what is accepted as scholarly truths. The way Catholics live in denial. The letter from Father Payeras, the horror at the reproduction of the romantic narrative, having to build a mission diorama in the 3rd grade. So there's a lot of really important, I should say, and deep truths here that need to be recognized. This last question, how do we justify the impact of the mission system on our Native Californians, our Indigenous Californians? How evangelization focus of archdiocesan ministry today is still in the same paradigm. So thinking about the connections to today. So there's obviously a lot here. The juxtaposition of today's gospel in the Catholic Church and Jewish inhabitants of Nazareth rejecting the idea of an inconvenient truth. So I wonder if there are either specific things, Dr. Cordero, that you saw in there that you'd like to address, or if there are other specific questions folks have that they'd like to posit for us.
Let me just say 2 things, and I really just like to open it up for folks to just to ask questions, even if it's the one that's already posted, or to share their thoughts or feelings. Also, that's fine too. Just a few things. As an academic, especially having read a lot of the scholarship from the past, which is mostly history, so it's done mostly by historians, some anthropologists, some archaeologists, some ethnohistorians, but mostly historians. There's obviously some serious methodological issues in lots of the scholarship that's been produced. And what's really, I think, interesting is the assumptions are built into the conventional narrative and therefore that kind of way of thinking about the world. So for example, think about this. When I was writing my article on conversion back in around 2015, I started writing that article, or maybe a little earlier, but I was in a discussion with someone who's a pro-Catholic scholar, and we were talking about conversion. I was saying, based on the evidence that we have, it looks like, less than 4% of California Indians were genuinely converted. And he turned to me and he said, you can't know somebody's heart. You can't know whether someone was genuinely converted. And I said, right. I said, but the pastors, the Franciscan missionaries who lived with the California Indians at the time could. That was their job, to understand their progress that they were making in their faith journey, right? But think about the implications of what he said for his own argument. The argument of the conventional narrative has always been that the California Indians were genuinely converted to Catholicism based on their having been baptized. So if I can't know that they were genuinely converted, then how can you know that they were genuinely converted, right? That assumption is built into the conventional narrative and has never been critically analyzed. It's just always been built in and assumed. But this person wasn't aware of the implications of the question that they were asking for their own argument. That's how deep this stuff runs, right? So that's a really good example of just how entrenched this is and how just, unconscious and, all of this is. So sources are really, really important for me. As a scholar, I mean, you can talk to folks who know me. I don't say anything if I can't prove it. And if I do, I'll qualify it and say, like the thing about, physical and sexual abuse. I can show you this, I'll eventually show you the sources, share the sources and all of that. How do we know that, that Sarah rode a mule or donkey and didn't walk? Well, the best we have is their own scholars who say that, right? And they talk about the journey, and there are, of course, letters that support it. I actually end up using most of the actual baptism and marriage and death records in my research. So I use the Franciscan records themselves to arrive at my statistics and my analysis. So I used their records when I wrote my article on conversion. I used their theology and their statistics to arrive at that conclusion. So as a scholar, I find it especially effective to use people's own arguments and data against them. If you ever want sources, you're welcome to. When I had my Sarah page up on my website, I had sources listed on the side for people to go look up, or I had links. So that's one. So sources, I'm happy to share what I know. And I never make an argument that I can't prove. And if I can't prove it, I'll try to qualify that. In regards to the causes of deaths at the California missions, definitely a lot of California Indians died of European diseases. But what's really interesting is that there's scholarship by Robert Jackson that shows that the death rates in Alta California, Northern California, not Baja, were higher than they were in Baja and northwestern New Mexico. So what's going on here in California? And so there are other things that are contributing to the high death rates. There are unsanitary living conditions. There's overcrowding. People are depressed. When you watch your spouse die, and then your children die, and then your grandparents die, and then your nieces and your nephews and your relatives die, just one after another, you can imagine the depression that sets in over the course of time. So all of these things are contributing to the high death rates in California. But the focus, of course, for Catholics is to focus on disease. Because if they say disease was the primary cause of death in California, then they're not responsible, right? Because disease did it, not us. But of course, the Europeans brought the diseases to California. And did they know, again, foreknowledge, did they know when they came to California that they would bring diseases? And the answer is absolutely yes, but they persisted anyway. Sarah was actually in Baja California for a year and a half before he came to California during a major epidemic that wiped out a good portion of the remaining Indians in Baja. So he had seen and been very well aware of that. So I'll stop there, and you all can just, yeah, ask questions, share what you want to share. Gary and Dominique, you're up first.
So thank you very much for this very powerful expose. My question is, you said you find it very powerful to refute people's argument using their own logic. But I wonder, is there not a case to address the ignorance of American society as a whole, rather than just the church ignorance on the mission? Because listening to you, it seems to me that, the facts speaks for themselves. I mean, for instance, the example of, the missionaries giving half of their income and then looking at how much Indians were actually paid. But I would go even one step further and argue that there was no labor market there. There was no voluntary exchange. These people were enslaved and they had no choice but to work. So it seems to me that the facts are so shocking that just, making them available to the broader public and perhaps reaching out to the church through the whole of society, rather than trying to, change the church from the inside. I'm wondering whether this could be also a strategy. Anyway, thank you for what you're doing. It really is God's work for all of us. That's also something I wanted to say.
Thank you, Jonathan. I really, I'm a historian, and that's always been my passion since of colonization. I've lived in other parts of the world, the Middle East and other things where colonization still exists even now, of course, but we won't go into that. But it's just that, yes, an acknowledgement in the present that we're, there's national myths. Every country has national myths. The church as an institution has myths that we buy into. But we just have to get a fuller picture. I don't want a new counter history, but I want to see the silent voices, and you're represent the ones, because the people who usually write history up to 50, 60 years ago, and then are the ones who win, the victors. And we're so interconnected, and an acknowledgement of the original inhabitants of this continent. And it's a tragedy of this whole continent. We're talking about California here, but of course, we used to live in the Northeast. We can talk about French colonialism. We can talk about the British and all the other, and you bring out these things that it's just trying to take apart some of these myths, try to get a fuller picture of this, not just creating a completely counter history. I know you're not wanting to do that. And then, of course, academia is dominated by things that are a la mode, and so. Anyway, thank you very much. I just, Dominique and I have lived in, well, we go to New Zealand, well, of course, the Maori thing is much more. And the thing that you're touching on disease, the history of disease, looking in what would be Mexico in the 16th century, probably there were 38 million inhabitants. Spaniards came with their allies, and of course, by the end of the century, there was 2 million. But the Mexican society was able to have its revenge. But anyway, that's enough.
Yeah, no, much appreciated. And just to let you know, there are other California Indian, and we'll put scholars in quotation marks here, who are sharing narratives and stories about their ancestors, the missions, or their own understandings. So it's not, I just do my thing. And thankfully, I'm not the only one doing it, and I'm not the only one doing it this way. So there are lots of other people doing it in lots of different ways, and eventually that information will get out. One of the things, Dominique, that I think would have been really amazing to do is if we had enough time and funding for the Critical Mission Studies project would be to put up a website with a lot of this information to make it more broadly available to the public. That said, the published volume of scholarship will be coming out in a year or two. That will be shared with the world. And then maybe at some point, you know, we can, for those folks who are interested, we can find a way to get that information out, you know, in a web form, just to make it easier for people to just see some of these really simple facts that we're talking about that are just, you know, look, everything is debatable, but in my mind, you know, I haven't come across any pro-Catholic scholar who's even come close to dismantling any of the arguments a lot of us have been making lately. They mostly just use, you know, distraction and deflection and euphemisms, you know, and vitriol to you know, to defend. And that's when, you know, you're winning the debate, right? When those kinds of responses come out. David.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Cordero. It's just so great to hear what you have to say. So grateful for your time being with us today and all the effort you put into your presentation. I was really struck by your point. I'm sure I'm not giving it exact justice, but we should stop talking about Father Sarah. We should focus on the mission system. And I'm wondering, you know, within the Catholic community, there are sensitivities there because of devotions to Father Sarah that those of us really interested possibly in reframing the conversation that way, we need to navigate and kind of figure out. But I know I'm also concerned about like reframing that conversation in light of the indigenous community because of their deep feelings of opposition on the part of many to Father Sarah. So I wouldn't want to come off saying, hey, let's stop talking about Sarah, let's start talking about the missions, and then offend a lot of indigenous persons who may feel like, well, we got to talk about Sarah. So I'm wondering, do you have any suggestions for us about how we might go about framing our desire to reframe the conversation, not to focus so much on Father Sarah, but focus instead on the mission system, especially in light of possible indigenous sensitivities around like not talking about Father Sarah?
Yeah, that's an interesting dilemma. I mean, it's not my dilemma because I've really said in all of my research, hey, Sarah's not the issue here. The mission system's the issue here. Most of what it boils down for Sarah is an assessment of his character. Like, what higher calling could a person possibly have in the Catholic Church than sacrificing their life for the sake of saving the souls of other people, right? And then to found a mission system on top of that that was responsible for doing that. I mean, oh my gosh, you know, why wouldn't you want to uphold this person, you know, in quotation marks, from a Catholic perspective? But, you know, the facts about Sarah are not even accurate, the ones that are in public. In the statue that we eventually got taken down in Ventura of Sarah, it says that he founded 9 missions in California. No, he didn't. He founded 6. And Fermin Lasuen was actually the one who founded more. He founded 9, right? So Sarah didn't baptize more people than anybody else. He didn't confirm any more people than anybody else. He didn't found more missions than anybody else. He wasn't father president longer than anybody else. There were lots of other people who had accomplishments that really outshined his in many ways. Why are we so, you know, thrilled about Sarah? Well, because Francisco Paulo wrote a book about his character. You know, his superb Catholic character. So we have some evidence there because he founded the California mission system. And don't we reward founders? But we usually reward founders of things that were successful, right? Not things that were not successful or destructive. So I don't know what the answer is. I think some people are going to want to really have a discussion about Sarah and others about the California mission system. I think it's all useful. It's just not where my focus is. But these conversations are really, really difficult to have with local parishioners and local priests, you know, in our communities, and they tend not to get very far. All of us California Indians have been working, you know, in Ventura, in Santa Barbara, it's Mission San Gabriel, to have conversations with the local Catholics, and they don't really go anywhere because the upper administrations are just really unwilling to let go of this narrative that they teach when people come on the tours, right? So there's just a lot of obstacles in place. But again, but we keep persisting and we keep trying. Those of us who care keep persisting and keep trying. And with your assistance, maybe we can begin to make more headway.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Emily.
Hi, thank you so much for all you've said. I really appreciate this time. I think Matt and everybody for putting this together. I guess I really want to hear from the from your community, what do you want? What would you, if you had it the way that you dream, I guess, what would your dream of Catholics be in response to this? Like what would that look like, and how would it play out? And I guess I really want an honest assessment, I guess, of what you would want to see.
Well, yeah, thanks for the question. And again, it is a question I get often. So I'm going to tell you what I want, but realize there are lots of other California Indians who have a vested interest in the missions, because that was the last point of contact for them, for their ancestors. And so those sites become really important for them. At Mission Dolores, where my ancestors are from, also, there's a mural on the wall behind the Reredos. My ancestors literally painted that mural, right? And so, yeah, I kind of have an attachment to that. It's maybe a little bit of a twisted attachment, but I have an attachment to that work of art, and twisted because of the conditions under which it was created, right? The coercive conditions under which it was created. Personally for me, and we keep saying this over and over again, but I still think it's worth repeating, an apology doesn't mean anything unless it first acknowledges the truth. So the Catholic Church has tried to apologize for the atrocities in the Americas, but they've never really acknowledged the full truth. So is it really an apology? Can you really get beyond that to any kind of relationship or reparations, with the Catholic Church, if you don't first start there? So my primary goal has only been, let's get the Catholic Church to admit the truth, because then everything else is possible, more or less. I mean, obviously you can have reparations without somebody telling the truth, I suppose. But that's it for me. But other California Indians, they want a relationship with the mission. They want to be able to visit the mission when they want to. They want to be able to access, items and records, when they want to. And the Catholic Church, after, the canonization of Sarah and the uproar, some Catholic churches began to allow that to happen, began to just open up a little bit and allow some of my colleagues in. But I think, that question is really for someone who has, who maybe is Catholic and has a strong tie to the missions. It's not really a question for me. I don't really have either. But I will say, most of the records for the California Indians are housed at Mission Santa Barbara, where I was born and raised. And the folks who work there have been amazingly kind and generous to me and allow me in to do research whenever I want. They know what I write about, and they still let me in. Because obviously, if they didn't, they'd be in worse trouble. But they've been really fabulous. But the relationship really doesn't go much beyond that. There's been no other kinds of real change there at Mission Santa Barbara because of it. But I have friends who've gone on the tours, and they're still telling the same, romantic narrative, even to this day, in spite of what, all the scholarship that we've produced. So probably not a great answer to your question, Emily, but that's the best I can do.
I have a question for you, Jonathan. This is
Hey,
Mark
Mark.
Day.
Mark, hold on one second. You can share in 1 second. I did want to drop this question in the chat because we were going to spend about 10 or 15 minutes with chewing on this question of what do we do with this previously missing information and previously missing for us. Now that we have it, what is our unique role? So Mark, feel free to go ahead and ask your question and Dr. Cordero can respond, but I'd also encourage folks to be chewing on this and maybe dropping some things into the chat and briefly out loud after this as we chew on that question. But Mark, go ahead.
Well, I did meet Jonathan, by the way, years ago in the Mission Archives, and I followed his stuff closely, and I really appreciate his work. But I just wanted to ask you, Jonathan, about this. It's often said that Sarah was a man of his times, and we cannot judge him from the present in terms of that. And but the short answer to that question is he wasn't a man of his times because he lived during the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment had filtered its way into the Spanish military and the governors, and they were the ones who were criticizing Sarah for excessive beatings and so forth. So my question was, did the message, that what the governors think, like Fages and so forth, think, did that filter down to the soldiers? Because obviously it wasn't, because the abuses continued. So that's my question.
Yeah, the argument that's, that Sarah was a, in quotation marks, a man of his time is used quite often, but we're all people of our time, right? If I commit murder, I don't get to go into court and say, yeah, I killed him, but, it was inevitable, right? The other argument that we hear, or I'm a man of my time, therefore, these are things that I do. There were lots of people of that time, and they were not all the same. As I was saying earlier, the civil authorities were far more liberal in wanting to grant rights to California Indians, and the California missionaries were much more conservative in wanting to retain control over California Indians. And so if we have, you're right, Mark, we have two sort of juxtapositions of persons of this particular historical period. And to say that someone is, simply just a person of their time is ridiculous. We all are. So what does that mean, right? It's just another way of trying to, evade responsibility, help the Spanish missionaries evade responsibility for what they did. We're all people of our time.
Thank you.
Bobby and Daryl, did you want to pose a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask Jonathan who he believes Archbishop Cordero and Archbishop Gomez was exorcising when they did the exorcisms at the statues. Who were they exorcising?
Well, I don't know the answer to that question. Obviously, you'd have to ask the Archbishop. I believe it was just the Archbishop of San Francisco who did that. I don't know that Gomez did that in LA. If anybody can correct me, that's fine. But I don't know what they were apparently exercising. It's really interesting. I know the people who tore down the statue in Golden Gate Park, and the majority of them weren't native. They were just, activists. So I think to a great degree, California Indians, we still get defined as pagan by the Catholic Church. And so maybe paganism was one of the things that they thought they were exercising. I'm going to apologize in advance for saying this, but in California, for lots of Catholics, Junipero Serra gets treated in the same way as Jesus. I mean, it is really remarkable to see the way that people latch on to Junipero Serra and the way that they talk about him and treat him. It's very Jesus-like. And I know that's sort of synonymous with the idea of what a saint is for Catholics. So to get back to an earlier question, yeah, those conversations with local Catholics, I think, are always going to be tenuous because of that. But yeah, I really don't know who they thought they were exercising at the statue. It was a very curious thing, but I don't understand it, so I shouldn't be commenting, on it.
Thank you.
So in this last 5 minutes before we close out, do invite folks to use the chat and even unmute here to kind of name what is our role. For me, I identify as Catholic. What is the whole for Catholics in this effort, in this struggle? Someone mentioning sharing with 1 to 3 Catholics not in the Zoom what we learned here. As Dr. Cordero has said before, our ability to maneuver within the institutional church is going to be dramatically different than someone who does not identify as Catholic. See, thanks also coming in the chat and invitations to churches. We do have ordained religious here from the Catholic Church who want to be a part of this. We have folks who serve in different capacities. So we hold power and we hold sway and we hold resources. And those are important things at our disposal. See a question about a collective boycott efforts for concerned Catholics to stop paying tithes or contributing to our parishes until the church acknowledged the flaws in the narrative. Speaking in our parishes. Really do invite folks to throw ideas out there. You know, we can do the discernment as we go, but what might be the right place for us? And Dr. Cordero, if you had any thoughts you wanted to share on the place of Catholics in the struggle to write this narrative and to begin a process of repairing and repenting, you know, you've already touched on it a number of times, but
I have, but maybe it's worth saying again, Matt. You know, Matt and I had talked obviously in preparation for this quite a bit, and I still think the fundamental approach is the same. You know, California Indians and California Indian scholars, all of us to some degree are scholars. We're doing research and certainly offering an alternative to the conventional narrative, right, to the romantic myth. People like me are also going further and you know, undermining the Catholic narrative, right, the conventional narrative that we see coming from the Catholic Church and other pro-Catholic scholars, and both are really important. But I feel like an outsider, and I feel like that the work that we're doing, especially in critical mission studies, does have an impact, and it certainly is changing the public. It's obviously changing K through 12 education. When the publication comes out, it'll probably change more. But I do feel, again, that groups like yours probably have the best opportunity to bring about change from the inside, you know, from within the Catholic Church itself. And I think that's a really critical and necessary role for those of you to play who choose to play that role. I just think it's really critical. And I was telling Matt, I said, you know, he's talking about the possibility maybe of doing a second session where we actually talk about more strategically how to go about doing this. And I said yes, because the role that you play is critical, I think, to changing things. I don't know that there's another group out there who has a more critical role in bringing about change within the Catholic Church. So I don't mean to put pressure on all of you. But I think you're all critical to doing that. So I'll stop there. Oh, and I did want to say one more thing, if you don't mind. I didn't share a lot of stories, and there are lots of stories to share about what happened to our ancestors at the missions. But they're really painful for me to have to share over and over again. And I do a lot of diversity, you know, what we've called historically diversity training. And this one question keeps coming up, which is, why do marginalized peoples have to continue to share their pain so that non-marginalized peoples get it, right? We have scholarship, we have histories. That should be enough to convince you that something needs to be done about this. But at the same time, I still realize that these stories are really powerful and moving. But they are oftentimes painful for us to share. So let me share one with you, because I think it's important for you to at least hear one story. At Mission Dolores in San Francisco, there was a tribal leader from down the coast, just north of Santa Cruz, who one of the other tribal leaders a little bit north was trying to recruit so their families could stay together because they had intermarried and everything. So he, you know, begrudgingly eventually comes to Mission Dolores in San Francisco, and it's just too hard. It's too hard for him to be there. So he leaves, and it was never acceptable at the missions for people to leave. You couldn't leave when you wanted to. You could leave for 2 weeks of the year, and you'd get permission to do that, to go back to your village and visit your family. But once you were at the missions, you were under total control, remember, of the Spanish missionaries. So he's just like, you know what, I'm done. And he takes off down the coast. And his wife and his sister-in-law and their kids follow suit, but they're lagging behind, if you know the coast along from about halfway down from San Francisco down to Santa Cruz. It's really rough and rugged, right? Difficult to get around. So the Franciscan missionary sends the soldiers out after the family, and they eventually catch up with the women and children, and they killed them in the rocks on the cliffs, right? And he, as far as we know, he escaped, you know, and went back to his tribe. That kind of scenario, right? That story makes its way back to the missions, and it's shared among the native peoples at the missions. And now it's like, you're here. If you leave, they're going to hunt you down and kill you. And it effectively creates what we call a culture of terror at the missions that these California Indians have to live with. You don't need to control people by gunpoint. The process of intimidation or creating a culture of terror is sufficient to control large populations of people, right? And there are worse stories out there, by the way. But this is the kind of thing that we have to understand is happening at the California missions, and the conventional scholarship is not going to share this understanding with you, right? They're not going to say that the Franciscan missionaries sent soldiers out and they killed women and children, right? So these are the things that are really missing, you know, from the conventional accounts. They just didn't make it into the conventional accounts. One more, just because I think this one's really powerful. At Mission San Buenaventura, and I apologize because we might go a little bit over, but at Mission San Buenaventura, the women and young girls stayed in what we call a monjerio, as a female dormitory for single women. And the Franciscan missionary would go into the female dormitory at night, which was under lock and key, unlock the door, tap the nun, and the nun was the head Indian woman who was in charge of the group, tap the nun on the shoulder, and she would start initiating a hymn, and all the women and girls in the room would sing a hymn. And then he would walk down the aisle and pick a woman or a girl and rape her while they were singing a hymn and leave. And this was done on a repeated basis. These are the stories that our ancestors are sharing with us in this case, in the Harrington notes, which are notes that a linguist took from our ancestors in the early 1900s. And they're sharing, you know, their memories and the stories that were told to them by their ancestors. These are the kinds of things, and this happened at this kind of thing happened at lots of different missions, and we have lots of different evidence for this. Obviously, these kinds of stories never made it into the conventional scholarship.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cordero. Obviously, these are just two of many, many stories, and we invite folks to continue to do your own research and to listen to the wisdom and talks that are out there by so many Indigenous scholars, activists, leaders, elders. We want to offer you just a couple of tangible ways to continue to get connected, and then we'll send us off this evening. I will send an email after this with all of the links, so don't worry if you miss anything, but since we're just in the final moments, I'll just read through them. This project works best if we grow our relationships both with those who have the responsibility to reckon with our mission histories, but also to be in relationship with our local Indigenous communities, to see what they need from us and to see where they see us fitting. If you're interested in being a part of either of those things, building our power or building our relationships with local communities, please reach out. One of the sacred sites here in Los Angeles, Kuruvungna Sacred Springs, opens for a community cleanup the first Saturday of every month. This next Saturday, February 5th, from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., community leaders and organizations will be coming together and we are invited to join and to support the work that's happening there. As Dr. Cordero has said before and mentioned kind of today, land back and rematriation is an ideal, but in reality, Native communities need the legal, financial, and human capacity to go along with the giving back of land so that the land doesn't become a literal burden. On Friday, February 11th from 9 to 11 a.m., there will be a Zoom panel discussion called Unsettling Settler Colonialism Through Philanthropy. It's an event which seeks to explore how we can responsibly equip our local Indigenous community, one specific local Indigenous community in Los Angeles, with the resources and support they need and deserve for their newly created Tovanga Tarahat Pahavaha Conservancy, which is preparing for land back here in Los Angeles. If you would like to know more or attend this event, there will be information in the follow-up email. And finally, as was mentioned in the chat, this will not be a top-down effort to bring truth to history in our church. The Los Angeles Archdiocese is beginning its synod process, which is supposed to allow the voices of those on the fringes and in the grassroots to reorient our church's direction. Now, while we are not naive to think that this work will be that simple, we do desire to be a part of the conversation. We would love to have your voice and wisdom and care for this work be a part of our process in demanding that our church address its legacy of settler colonialism and other very important issues. If you would like to be a part of a synod circle specifically calling our church to repair and repent for this, we will have information in the follow-up email. As Dr. Cordero said, we don't have a next date or session specifically picked out, but there is obviously much to dive into. So we hope you'll keep checking our emails for the information so that you can continue to be a part of it. So once again, finally, thank you so much, Dr. Cordero, for your work and your witness and your time, and an invitation to all of us to know this reality continues once we close this Zoom today. What part will we play in shaping a new future and not returning to the past where maybe we were unable to see the truth, unable to see the fullness and clarity of the stories and the people. Let us be impacted, let us be changed, and let us continue our work together. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day. Feel free to unmute yourself, and we'll all be in touch soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cordero. Thank you, Matt.
You're welcome.
Thank
you all
you,
for being
thank
here.
you.
Thank
Great to be with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Hi, Ken.
Good to have you all here.
Thanks, Dr. Cordero.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony.